Well, my first guest tonight is Stephen Wertheim, a senior fellow at the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's also an author of the book Tomorrow, the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy. Stephen, it's good to have you on the program tonight. We saw what happened yesterday. We had Ukrainian and Russian negotiators sitting down in Turkey talking about possible ways to get to peace. Today, Moscow saying that it sees nothing promising in those talks. What do you think it's going to take to force, and I'm using the word force here, Russia to end this war?
Unfortunately, it looks like it will take considerably more time at a minimum. You know, I think that the talks, if one expected the talks to suddenly produce peace, that was too high an expectation. So I think it'd be fair to say some progress was made, particularly on the issue of a neutral status for Ukraine vis-a-vis NATO, but the territorial claims loom the largest. Russia appears to be shifting its aims in the war to eastern Ukraine, although it continues to shell Kyiv and other places in the north, so we'll have to see about that. But if Russia is indeed refocusing its campaign on taking land in eastern Ukraine, my sense is that it probably wouldn't be willing to make any kind of agreement until it has captured what it deems to be enough land in order to call what Russia has achieved some kind of victory for domestic purposes.
And calling it a victory, I guess, will depend on Vladimir Putin calling it a victory. Can there be peace then as long as Vladimir Putin is in charge? We know that the U.S. president's recent comments, they suggest a lot of exasperation with Moscow, but do you think Washington has given up any hope of having a peace deal while Putin is still in power?
Well, unfortunately, there probably is no alternative to making peace with Putin. If there will be peace between Russia and Ukraine, there aren't compelling signs that I see that Putin is losing his grip on power. And in fact, sanctions can have the opposite effect. So I think it remains still compelling to pursue a peace settlement, provided there's no undue expectations or excessive trust, which is to say basically any trust in what Russian negotiators may say. Otherwise, we're in for a very long war of attrition, which would be deeply unfortunate. But usually it takes a long time for parties to make peace because both sides have to come to a recognition and an acceptance of where they stand. And in this case, there are important international parties as well. You mentioned Washington. It probably would require some kind of sanctions relief by the West in order for there to be a peace settlement.
And before this invasion began, there were weeks of a flurry of diplomacy, and it was clear then that Vladimir Putin was only really interested in talking with the United States because he considers the U.S. to be an equal. Is part of the problem here that Vladimir Putin wants the world, particularly Washington, to see Russia as a superpower?
I think those concerns do seem to resonate with Putin, given what he says. However, he's taken the wrong approach if he wanted to be respected as the head of a superpower or a great power. I think it's entirely possible that had he chosen the path of a diplomatic resolution to the crisis back in January, that there would have been some degree of opening to reconsider Russia's status in the European security architecture. That conversation was starting to open, but now there seems to be no chance of Vladimir Putin being welcomed back into the West or being shown respect. It's possible that sanctions could be lifted, but it won't be the kind of status that Putin perhaps was seeking.
And all the while we're seeing Russia move closer and closer to China. The Chinese and the Russian foreign ministers today reaffirmed the two countries' relationship. But I'm wondering, is China offering any real support to Russia?
China doesn't seem to be offering material support to Russia, and that is very significant and can get lost in some of the rhetorical support that China has shown to Russia. In this sense, because China is not, at least so far, sending military supplies to Russia, it is being neutral in the war more so than countries that are materially aiding Ukraine. I don't mean that as a moral statement, since Russia's war is obviously wrong and illegal, but China is trying to walk a line, and it does seem to be complying with Western sanctions, though obviously it's not joining in imposing sanctions itself. So China continues to try to have its strategic relationship with Russia and also maintain decent relations with the West. That's the balancing act. And it's pretty clear, though, that China's principled, its longstanding insistence on respect for sovereignty and independence and the UN Charter, those have been reduced to lip service.
Steve, let me ask you before we run out of time, how worried should Europe be about U.S. commitment, particularly to NATO? The last polls show that if there were to be an election today, former President Donald Trump would beat Joe Biden.
Well, right now, Joe Biden is the president, and I think his commitment to defending what he calls every inch of NATO territory is very real. But you're absolutely right. We have to think down the line, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and so on. And to me, it seems like a gamble to hinge the defense of Europe, of NATO, on the United States from far away being willing to take enormous risks when the time comes. For the sake of Latvia, for example. So I think the awakening that is going on in Europe to its responsibilities, that's something to be encouraged. But it's important, I think, to channel it in a direction in which Europe can defend itself, can have autonomy, and doesn't just seek to renew its dependence on U.S. security protection.
Stephen Wertheim with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Stephen, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Valuable context in this situation. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I'm joined by Frank Ledwidge. He's a former UK military intelligence officer. He also advised the UK government on foreign policy and is now a senior lecturer in strategy and law at the University of Portsmouth. Do we have our guest? There he is. Yeah, yes. The technology is a little tricky with us tonight, Frank. We appreciate you joining us. You know, many have said that Vladimir Putin is aiming to divide Ukraine, like the Korean Peninsula is divided today. You wrote, though, that Ukraine is turning into Putin's bleeding ulcer. Why do you say that?
The reference to bleeding ulcer actually comes from a couple of hundred years ago when Napoleon was trying to fight the Spanish and Portuguese, and he put 600,000 people into Iberia and about 80,000 came out. It was his bleeding ulcer. What many of us think is going to happen, certainly what I think may well happen over the next phase, is that Putin will get into a war that he not only cannot win, but that he can't really extract himself from. And it'll be a sink into which he'll pour money and material for as long as the Ukrainians fight. And that's going to be a long time.
Do you think that Vladimir Putin knows exactly what is going on the ground in Ukraine in terms of the performance of his military?
It's very difficult to say that. His is a closed information system. And even in the West, and when we saw this, for example, in Afghanistan, with Western generals not really receiving very good information and certainly not passing it up, there are politicians, of course, who don't want to hear bad news, and Putin may be one of those. What we can be sure of, though, is that the reports or that the system is generating will be fairly accurate, from the FSB across to the military intelligence. Whether it's percolating upwards, though, as you just hinted there, very different question. Very difficult to know.
I'm wondering, Frank, how good is our intelligence? I mean, would you consider the rapid collapse of the Afghan army after the U.S. withdrawal last year, the inability of Russia to quickly take Kyiv. I mean, we're in week 5 now of this invasion. On both of these accounts, Western intelligence got it wrong.
Western intelligence, I would assess actually as being very, very good, by and large, with respect to Ukraine. And it's one element of the war that, not surprisingly, particularly the Western contribution to it's really not been talked about. As we speak, there are Western intelligence gathering aircraft in the air to the west and north of Ukraine, sucking up all the signals intelligence they can, peering into the fog of war there. Not only that, of course, but we've got other kinds of assets, and we have an ally, or rather, an ally in the excellent Ukrainian military intelligence service. So overall strategic assessments, I think, have been quite good. It's very difficult, as you've hinted, though, to get some ground truth, particularly because both sides are pumping out information that might sometimes be categorized on both sides as propaganda.
Yeah, that's a very good point to make. And that leads me then to the situation we're in tonight. 24 hours ago, there was talk, the deputy Russian defense minister saying that there was going to be a dramatic reduction in military activity around the capital, Kyiv. And last night, there were air raid sirens across the city. There have been more attacks today. I mean, the words and the deeds, when it comes to the Russian military, they just don't match.
Well, that certainly appears to be the case. What may be happening is that there's what's called a fighting withdrawal going on. Withdrawing in combat is a very difficult military activity to carry out. I suspect that the artillery barrages that Matthias was referring to earlier and that we've heard about before may be covering something of a redeployment driven by military realities. I mean, certainly at least one battalion group, which is about 1,000 people, have been redeployed out of the country, as far as we know. And that's likely to continue as the Russians go onto the defensive in the north, which, as I said before, that's a military reality. They've essentially been fought off there.
Frank Ledwidge with the University of Portsmouth. Frank, we appreciate your time and your valuable analysis tonight. Thank you.
My pleasure.